I'm joined on the Crispin Flintoff show by Brian Mier, who's the Brazil correspondent for Telesur English and has been a journalist living in Brazil for 30 years. Thank you for coming on, Brian. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks for having me.
And now the reason that I like to speak to you is that this story's come out this morning all over national media here as well as probably all over the world. It's Bolsonaro, Brazil's ex-president, sentenced to 27 years in jail for coup attempt, as Trump warns conviction is very bad for the country. What's what's your can you just let us know what this is about? What's he been jailed for? And yeah, what's the background to this?
Well, it all started really in 2018. In 2018, when the electoral courts showed some signs that they were going to try to investigate illegal use of WhatsApp social media app during the election season. Eduardo Bolsonaro, Jair's son, who's very close to Steve Bannon and the Trump family, he had feed seen by hundreds of thousands of people that it would only take a few soldiers to shut down the Supreme Court. And at that moment, violent threats against Supreme Court ministers exploded. So a few months later, one of the justices, Dias Toffoli, decided to open an investigation into threats against the Supreme Court, including online threats. Okay. At this point, they turned it over to this justice named Alexandre de Moraes. It's a long background story, but basically in Brazil, unlike, for example, the United States, I don't know how it works in the UK. In the United States, the Supreme Court has its own police force, and regular federal judges have their police force called the US Marshals, who part of their responsibility is to investigate people who are violently threatening judges and their family members. Brazil doesn't have this system. It has regular police, civil police detectives who are tasked with this. In the case of the Supreme Court, it's the federal police. But if they don't feel like the investigation's being done very well, they can order their own investigations. So this was the beginning of the investigation against Bolsonaro and his allies. And they uncovered a lot of information. And some of the tactics they use, they ordered deplatforming of people. For example, from the social media, for example, Alando Santos, who doxed Supreme Court ministers live on the air, giving out their home addresses and the names of their children and things like that. And that was considered by libertarians like Glenn Greenwald to be an assault against freedom of speech, but not according to Brazilian law. So that's the background with Alexandre de Moraes and why he's turned into this kind of boogeyman for the international far right. After the violent Capitol incursion on January 8th, 2023, which happened after Bolsonaro refused to acknowledge that he'd lost the election, Parliament initiated an investigation and then issued a 3,000-page final report on it with mountains of evidence showing that starting in 2021, a group of people around Jair Bolsonaro, including him, but also his son Carlos and people working on social media and rich businessmen, started a strategy to try to discredit the electoral system, to preemptively prepare for a case in which Bolsonaro might not be reelected to help him maintain power. So they spent 2 years spreading disinformation about Brazil's electronic voting system, which never has had any documented case of hacking since it was first introduced in 1996. A few weeks before the election, Bolsonaro broadcast on live television a 2-hour meeting with over 100 foreign diplomats in which he railed against the electronic voting system, said it was definitely going to be hacked. If he lost the election, it was because of hacking. And he didn't provide any evidence to back this up. In fact, at the time, his own military conducted an internal investigation to see if the system was vulnerable for hacking, and the results were that it wasn't. And so he repressed publicizing the results of the study. This has come out later. Because of that episode, using the public television apparatus to spread disinformation about the elections, he was disqualified by the Electoral Court for running for office for a period of 8 years. Then he lost the election, and on January 8th, there was this violent incursion. What the parliamentary investigation uncovered was that they had conspired. They'd even developed a list of notes on how they could trigger a state of siege. What they were hoping to do on that day, it wasn't just the invasion of the capital, but 17 places across the country, high tension wires were sabotaged to cut off electricity to different towns and cities. There was a person connected to the Bolsonaro movement who was arrested trying to plant a bomb in the airport on Christmas Eve. There was a riot under the hotel where Lula was staying when he came into Brasilia after he was elected to officially receive his credentials as the next president, in which cars were burnt with Molotov cocktails. There was an attack on the federal police headquarters. So it's a very different scenario than what happened in January 6th with Trump, which seems much more spontaneous, right? It's a false equivalency to compare these two things. The plan was to pressure Lula to declare a state of siege. At this point, the military would be granted control over the national security apparatus. And according to the notes, a detailed coup plan, which was uncovered in some of the defendants' possession, that people have testified that Bolsonaro signed off on. The idea was immediately after a state of siege was declared to arrest Supreme Court ministers and arrest Lula, and then announce that there were going to be elections in a few months. To Lula's credit, he didn't declare a state of siege that day. That day, he just he ordered the federal police to come in and shut down the riots, and they did. They came in with tear gas and shut it down in like 15 minutes. So it didn't work. We also now know that it didn't work because some of the key figures in the army didn't go along with it, although the commander-in-chief of the Navy did. He's now facing a prison sentence of 24 years. He was one of the defendants yesterday. So basically, parliamentary investigation, which recommended the indictments of about 35 people. This was followed by a federal police investigation. The final report from the federal police investigation was 1,000 pages. They uncovered 70 terabytes of data and evidence. And then after the federal police investigation, it was turned over to the Attorney General's office. They conducted an investigation with the final report being 272 pages long of documented proof against Bolsonaro and 32 of his allies. So this court case that ended yesterday was the core, what they call the core nucleus of the coup, the command center of the coup attempt, which was Bolsonaro and 7 allies, okay? Among these 7, 4 high-ranking officers of the military. It's the first time since military coups started in Brazil in 1891 that a high-ranking member of the military has ever been convicted for involvement in a coup. So this is a historic first. And among these military officers is General Augusto Heleno, who many remember as the leader of MINUSTA's military operations in Haiti in 2004 during the Cité Soleil massacre. He was Bolsonaro's institutional security chief, overseeing 17 departments, including intelligence, for the entire 4 years of his term. And he's been sentenced to 21 years in jail. It's hard to compress all this information into a very short interview. I hope that made some sense.
I think that's just incredible amount of stuff. But I mean, when I saw the headlines at first, my immediate response was, how many presidents is Brazil jailing? Because they jailed Lula, and now Bolsonaro. I mean, Lula
And
was obviously
Collor as well, Fernando Collor.
So is it that if you become president, you get a jail sentence coming soon?
Well,
No, I'm being facetious, but
yeah.
I don't see any other countries that presidents are not. I mean, if Tony Blair commits war crimes here, no one does anything. It's like the heads of
Well, you look,
states are never given this
yeah,
sort of
it's actually
scrutiny.
a lot more common in Latin America. You look at Peru. Peru has jailed 3 or 4 former presidents in the last 30 years. Ecuador, the Ecuadorian government illegally broke into the Mexican embassy to imprison former Vice President Georgie Glass last year. Rafael Correa is in exile to avoid being in prison in Bolivia. Evo Morales is in exile to avoid being imprisoned. So it's actually in countries that are constantly suffering US intervention and US sponsored coup d'etat attempts, it's more common to have people arrested. It's just the way things go down here. But in the case of Brazil, it's a sign that the democracy is working because, first of all, Lula was arrested and he chose not to go into exile. He was arrested after they opened up an exception to the Constitution to enable his imprisonment during an election year before his appeals process is played out. And so once he was able to play out his appeals and everything and present more evidence, the entire case was thrown out. All the evidence was ruled ineligible, and all the charges were reversed, and he got out. He proved his innocence. In the case of Bolsonaro, he's allowed to have his appeals. There's going to be a period now in which the defense lawyers can make their final attempts to try and push the case to the full 11-member body of the Supreme Court. He's under house arrest for obstruction of justice. He was caught sending about $4 million to his son Eduardo, who's up in the United States lobbying with the Trump administration to try and increase sanctions on Brazil. So that was viewed by the court as obstruction of justice. So he's in house arrest, but he is allowed to have his appeals process played out. There might be some reduction of sentence or something like that. He's expected to go to jail sometime in the next 2 months.
So, I mean, the other question, I know you're busy and you've got loads of interviews to do and stuff. What has the response been in Brazil? I mean, are there people who are angry and want to fight for Bolsonaro, or is there a worry that there'll be a disruption, unrest in the country?
Well, there's a lot of disinformation in the international press about the size of the last Bolsonaro rally last week. There's a movement to try and pass a law that would grant amnesty. They'd actually have to change the Constitution to do that. The rally was about 42,000 people on the streets, which is a pretty big rally, but when you consider it's São Paulo, which has a population of 24 million in its greater metropolitan area, and the fact that in January there was a Bolsonaro rally that drew 220,000 people to the same location in São Paulo, it shows that the support is diminishing for Bolsonaro at this moment, but he still has a fanatical group of right-wing reactionary core supporters who are going to cause problems right now. And he does have a large political party in Congress called the Liberal Party, which is fighting to try and get him out of jail somehow. Although it doesn't look like any legal measure of getting him out of jail will work because once again, it would be inconstitutional to just pass a law and grant him amnesty since he's been convicted.
So, so you don't think that it is a massive threat of a kind of counter revolution or some kind of disruption or anything like that?
Much like the Trump people in the US, the MAGA people, and the Tea Party, for example, 10 years ago, one characteristic of these far-right movements is that they're engineered from above to make it look like they're grassroots movements. And so anytime you get a big Bolsonaro rally, it's because rich businessmen have paid for hundreds of bus loads of people to come in from the countryside, often paying them money to participate in the protests. This gives an illusion of greater size. I don't think there's any danger of a people's counter-revolution or counter-protest against Lula at this point. The danger is a military coup, and that's because of the Trump administration green-lighting the Brazilian military, obviously trying to encourage the Brazilian military to have a coup, which is certainly what's going on right now. In 2022, as Bolsonaro and his people were plotting this auto coup to stay in power, General Walter Braga Neto, who was sentenced to 26 years yesterday, approached people in the US and Russian governments to see if they could get support for this coup. Both the Russian government and the American government told them they wouldn't support it. And that apparently is the main reason that the commander-in-chief of the army, for example, didn't get on board with the coup attempt. At this point, if a similar request was made or a similar question was made to the US government, I'm pretty sure the US government would say they would support it. And we know that of the military top brass, the base military, the enlisted men and the sergeants and low-level officers, in their vast majority, are fanatical right-wing reactionaries who get all their information from social media, and worship Bolsonaro. The upper brass is made up of around 70% officers who like Bolsonaro and 30% who are conservatives, but they believe in the Constitution and they believe the military's role is upholding the Constitution, so they would not engage in a coup. So it's a touchy situation right now. And I think that's the real danger, some kind of top-down rupture with democracy, not any kind of people's revolution.